Every day, you essentially pay your dues by doing the harder thing when it's the right thing to do. All right, we're good. Yeah, Becca, how are you?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm doing awesome. Thank you so much for doing this. I really appreciate your time.
Oh, yeah. Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, we were just talking about the weird divine interventions of who you meet and who you know, and like, I was telling you that I went to school with Ian Kreider, and then you met him with down in Tennessee, and now you guys are working together. It's like you guys were made to be together. You and Ian working together.
Mm-hmm. I know it's been really great being able to work with Ian and having him, ask me to be a part of his gymnastics doc on Facebook, and then moving on to actually working for his business and doing therapy with any athletes that are struggling with mental health issues, especially gymnasts.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's something we see definitely evolving. I think like everyone has the utopian dream of like a college situation where you have like a nutritionist on staff and a mental health counselor and a great, set of gymnastics coaches, and you have all these people around you. But the club level, man, it's so hard to get like a good team around the athletes. And I think it's one of the biggest things we struggle with.
Yeah, no, I completely agree, because there's a lot that's going on, especially with these little kids that, we're not teaching them how to cope with certain things. And a lot of them are moving way beyond, their cognitive abilities physically. So it's once they get to that level that they actually start thinking about what they're doing, they start to freak out and they don't know how to cope anymore.
Yeah, absolutely. It's funny. We were just talking about this. The clinic that I work at is full of like a lot of pro baseball players and a lot of pro golfers, stuff like that. So we have these conversations about, ESPN's on. And of course, Simone right now is just ripping, the world apart on fire with how well she's doing. But they were saying like, is Simone the greatest athlete of all time? And I was arguing like, because of the fear aspect of the sport, like, I don't want to discredit anybody. Soccer is very hard. It's very scary sometimes. Baseball is very scary sometimes with the pressure. But like the risk of physical harm is so high in gymnastics that I think that makes some athletes, especially like combat wrestling or MMA and gymnastics, like much more on the. I put more weight in the Simones of the world and like those type of people, because the fear is so real. And it's weird in gymnastics that we expose 9, 10, 11, 12-year-olds to seriously high levels of fear. And I think it's I wanted to get you on the show, because like it's so hard to deal with young athletes who just don't understand what's happening. They don't know how to phrase these things. They don't know how to talk to people about the fear. It's very real for these young athletes.
Oh yeah. And the coaches, have such a major role in their lives, because they're like seeing this coach as like someone they really look up to. And if it's not a safe, trusting environment for them, they are never going to say anything. So we need to have that space for them that they feel safe enough to come up to us and share, their concerns, talk about like, because a lot of kids don't understand what emotions really are.
Sure.
Their emotional vocabulary is not very developed. So sometimes they need that time to explore what's going on in their mind, explore what they're feeling, like play with you back and forth on words, like trying to figure out exactly what it is, because they don't know what it is.
Right.
But if you don't give them that opportunity to kind of explore those words and try to figure out what's going on with them, then they aren't going to ever figure it out, one, and then they're not going to have that strength, that courage, that confidence to continue on and to do harder skills.
Right. Yeah. I remember definitely being a young gymnast, and, kind of especially like in like the puberty area of like 12 to 13 is like just not really knowing how to, like you said, label some things that were going on. And it was kind of like the tough guy environment. Right. So like I never really knew how to explain like I'm terrified, or, like I'm insecure about this, or I don't know how to handle this pressure, especially to meet and stuff. And luckily I had a great coach who was able to kind of just like talk it out and go back and forth. But I see that in a lot of young gymnasts, especially in the clinic on the medical side, but also coaching, is like, they just don't have, like you said, the vocabulary to express, what am I feeling? Is this a good thing? Is this a bad thing? I don't know how to like say it in a way that makes me feel as though I'm actually expressing what I have going on inside me. So, I mean, you're working now as a clinical mental health counselor with a lot of gymnasts. Is that something you see also too? Is there just like, you have to like pry it out of them to like get them feeling what's going on there?
Yeah, so a lot of what I do, especially at the beginning, is trying to give them those words. We talk about those words, what they mean, and what situations could you experience these types of feelings, like jealousy, embarrassment, anger, anxiety, fear. So like all those words, if I give them examples and be like, what do you think this child is feeling in this, this scenario? Like, is that anxiety for them? And then they're like, oh, that is anxiety. And that's something, I've experienced. So yeah, we discuss the words, what they mean, what we can put them in, what kind of situations, and then how we can use those, to describe ourselves later on.
Yeah. And do you find that there's a link between some of the things I think coaches and parents see on the surface level that are really hard to deal with, right? So like mental blocks, or like these, I always think of them like as irrational fears, because it's different for me as a coach or someone who works with athletes. Like, oh, if you had an injury or you fell on this skill, it's a rational fear. I get why you're nervous. You've experienced it. But I think oftentimes we just see these random mental blocks come up. Like there's no accident, there's nothing that was wrong, but they just like, I don't want to go backwards, or like, I don't want to do a flyaway. And I think we see on the surface level, like mental blocks or frustrations or things that are challenging mentally are probably a result of some things deeper that they just don't know how to express how they feel. Or like you said, maybe the environment is a little bit hard for them to kind of express those things in a safe way. Am I wrong in that? Or is that actually something you see?
No, that's exactly what I see. Yeah. I feel like one of the major emotions that kids experience is embarrassment. And that's one that they never want to talk about. You know, like they're not going to tell their coach that they feel embarrassed or that they don't want to be made fun of by their teammates or have their teammates whispering about them. Because, you know, little kids, even teenagers, were very self-centered and not in a bad way. You know, like the world just kind of revolves around them.
Yeah.
And when they see other people talking, they think it's about them.
Sure.
So a lot of things are internalized, and those, you know, that emotion alone causes so many issues when it comes to mental blocks, when it comes to anxiety and fear that I've seen working with a gymnast.
Yeah. And I'm really happy we're starting with that, because I personally think that is one of the hardest things to deal with as a coach, but also it's one of the most common things I think everybody deals with. I think a lot of kids, especially like 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, they really just want to fit in. They're trying to figure out who they are. They're trying to figure out their social setting, who their friends are. And a lot of times gymnastics and their skills and being, you know, able to do skills, unfortunately in their mind, is a proxy of I fit in and people like me. Like that, when we know that's not the healthiest way to maybe go about it. But at that time in their mind, between the exposure to social media, the exposure to, you know, meets and scores and competition, they're trying to figure out what they have to kind of like be as a place in this environment. And so I would say that a lot of times I see, you know, that embarrassment comes up when they can't do a skill, or maybe they get an injury or something happens and they feel as though their world kind of falls apart because they can't be with their friends. They can't be, you know, here. They're worried about what their coach is saying about them. Like you said, they're worried about people talking behind their back. And sometimes, unfortunately, it's true with just like brutal teenager life. But a lot of times it's really not that true. Like you're not actually being gossiped about and stuff, but they perceive that as, oh my God, everyone's talking about me, or like, oh my God, it's just so embarrassing and stuff like that. So from your experiences working with gymnasts who kind of maybe have that problems, I guess, what are the situations that you hear about that are pretty common scenarios, like that are coming up with people that have worries for it?
Oh yeah. So one that, you know, like I've kind of recently been working with is like if you get scared on an event, you know, a lot of little kids want to cry. And they're like, but I can't cry because if I cry, other people are going to make fun of me because I'm crying. And they're like, why are they crying? This is ridiculous. Yeah. So with the embarrassment, you know, they're kind of trying to change where they're going with their skills, because they're like, I'm not going to do a skill that's going to scare me because I don't want to cry in front of my teammates. I don't want them talking about me. And then, you know, the whole going up to your coach and telling them that you're nervous. I always ask my gymnasts, I'm like, why don't you just tell your coach you're nervous? And so they know that they might need to spot you a little bit more this first time, or, you know, the next few times that you run through a skill. And they always tell me, and they're like, I can't go up and tell them I'm nervous. What if someone hears me? You know, what if they make fun of me? What if they say something like, oh, get over it, just go back in line and do it? So a lot of times it's just, you know, it's a perception of what people think, but it's really what people are doing too that makes them feel like they can't do their skills, or, you know, they don't feel respected, or they don't feel included within the gym.
Totally. And I'm really happy. This is by far and away, I think, one of the biggest problems culturally we still have as a sport is the like you said, the fear of talking to coaches or parents about something going on, whether it's a mental block, whether it's the start of pain, whether it's, you know, just being, you know, overall overwhelmed or something like that. And I think I want to first start on the not commonly talked about situation, which is great coaches doing everything right. They have a great gym, great communication. And so there's so many great coaches out there that are amazing, but unfortunately the gymnast still, for some reason, does not feel I can talk about. Like, I can't tell you how many people I have in the clinic for injuries. And I'm like, when did your back start hurting? They were like, oh, 2 months ago. I'm like, well, why didn't you tell your coach? They're like, oh, I can't do that. I can't tell my coach. Like, they're going to think I'm a wuss. They're going to make fun of me. They're going to, like, you know, yell at me or something like that. I'm like, I don't think so. Like, I know your coach, and I'm pretty sure I've never seen him or her yell at someone for their back being sore. So I guess from the first perspective of like the gym is great, the culture is great, the coaches are great, but the kids are just not speaking up. I know a lot of coaches who are frustrated with that. What are either the tools or strategies that maybe like the coaches can do to foster more communication about, hey, it's okay to tell me if your back hurts. It's okay to tell me if you're scared. We can work on this, because I think a lot of coaches are stuck in that situation. It's very frustrating.
Right. Yeah, no, I completely agree. And, you know, one of the first things that I think is important is our nonverbal communication, because we talk about communication so much. We're like, oh, we need to communicate. But a lot of times we don't talk about exactly how we're supposed to do that. And I think one of the important things is nonverbal communication and what we're putting off. So what is our body language? You know, when we're in the gym, what are our mannerisms? Like, what are our facial expressions? Like, all that stuff's so important for making us approachable when, you know, our athletes want to come and tell us something. Because if we are standing in the corner of our gym and our arms are crossed and we're kind of have this like furrowed brow kind of thing going on, that's not very approachable, right? Especially for a little kid. Like, we are like, oh, well, that's just my normal facial expression. But when it comes to children, that can be scary. And they're like, oh gosh, my coach is in a bad mood. I can't go talk to him now. That's scary. So just kind of reassessing how you are in the gym. Do you put yourself in a position where your athletes can approach you? Do you have, like, are you inviting to them? And when you're listening to them, are you actually listening to them, or are you watching other athletes on other events? So, like, if you are watching someone, it's good to just tell them, be like, hey, I need to watch, this other girl finish this beam routine.
Yeah.
And then I'll talk to you. Just give me 1 second. And then if it's a child, you want to get down on their level. And I think that's a really big important thing, because, you know, if you're standing up, it kind of makes them feel like there's this hierarchy, and they're not as likely to share information with you. So if you get down on their level and you look them in the eye and you actually pay attention to them when they're speaking to you, I think that makes a big difference, because we're showing that we're available and we're there for them.
Yeah, that's very important. I couldn't agree more. I think I can definitely think back to some facepalm moments when my either like, you know, frustration or something else had nothing to do with the gym, right? It had nothing to do with what I was working with. I just like came from my other job and I had a rough day and I had paperwork and traffic, and I was just like, oh man, this is like, I'm just running around. And my vibe was definitely not, Dave's probably in a good, you could probably talk to Dave, you know, it's probably not like that. So I think that's important for coaches and parents too. Like, I'm not a parent. I don't, you know, have wife or kids, but I'm empathetic to parents, because man, you got a little kid who's like, you know, another younger brother who's running around, and you're trying to get to the gym and you're trying this, and, you know, maybe the young girl is trying to say something to her mom or dad before they go to the gym that they really want to get expressed. Like, you know, my back hurts, or I'm nervous about this, or something went on, and they're just so busy running around that they don't really have that time to be approachable. So I do think that's very important to start with the nonverbal stuff. And the other piece of advice I can give is, I think, unfortunately, the current culture is very reactive in dealing with these problems. So like, when someone's back hurts, then we deal with it. When there's an issue with a mental block and we see it, then we deal with it. But I think if you can proactively kind of attack those things from the other side and say, like, you know, openly say like, hey, is anyone struggling something now? Like their knees hurt, something like that. Anyone struggling on something they're worried about? If so, you know, we can talk about it at a different time. I think if you proactively say it's okay to talk about those things and give people strategies or tools and pieces from people like yourself or others that, like, hey, I was reading this blog and we talked about mental blocks. Let's talk about mental blocks for a couple of seconds. Like, and maybe no, you're not singling anybody out, but that gives them like a psychological safety in the group to be like, oh, they care about this. They want to hear about this. They value this in our gym. So maybe I'm more open to talk to them about it.
Right. Yeah, I completely agree. And I think, you know, incorporating those things into your practice. So it's like on Tuesdays and Thursdays, you know, we have a short discussion before practice. It's kind of like, you know, preventing mental blocks and stuff. Like, you know, we always talk about deep breathing. Like, I always think that incorporating those things into your practice are very important. So we're not teaching them just like, hey, do this in the moment when you need it, but we're going to make this a part of our gym culture now. So yeah, and I think adding mental health stuff to your gym culture is very important. And I know, like, coaches have so much to do. So it's like we're like telling them that they need to be college recruiters, they have to be coaches, they have to be physical therapists, they have to be mental health, you know, practitioners. So like, I understand it's like they're getting so much put on their plate, but if we just change like a little bit, like, you don't have to do therapy with your gymnast, but if we incorporate just a little bit in changing how we interact with them and we make ourselves more approachable and welcoming, it can change the environment in the gym, I think, substantially.
Yeah. And I think this is the value of working with an expert team of people who you can kind of connect with virtually or get education from, and pass pieces of education onto your athletes, right? I really believe in a couple of things. One is like finding 15-minute pockets to like have a whiteboard session where you talk about, I don't know, schedule management, you talk about fear, you talk about, what it is to be a good teammate, you talk about sleep strategies. Like there's a lot of little ways you can take nuggets from experts who are out there in the field and kind of pass them on. But also, talked about proactively is like make a binder at the beginning of the year with a bunch of resources that you think are really great from like a nutritionist that you follow, and then something from like a physical therapist you follow, and just put them in a packet and be like, okay, here's a nice little resource that you can use throughout the year for parents and for gymnasts should something come up. Like you're again taking the step before a problem comes up, and it's not weird when you guys talk about these things.
Right. Yes, exactly. I completely agree with that. And then even like you could make those packets up and you could address those things as you go on, like 1 week we could do 1 page of nutrition, physical therapy, mental health, so we're just slowly kind of building up this like toolbox for them of things that they can reach in and grab and use when they need it.
Yeah, that's a great idea, right? Like having maybe like a theme of the month, right? Like in this month, we're all going to talk about, sleeping and recovery. On this month, we're going to talk about mental health and fears. On this, and like maybe once per month, you hire someone to come in for 30 minutes and talk about it, or you do a virtual session with someone for a 45-minute session once a week. We did that in our summer camps, and the kids loved that kind of stuff the most because it was like, the things they know they needed help with. But like you said, the shame and embarrassment sometimes of being the person who can't flip backwards or being the person who always has a knee injury, like that's very concerning for them. And they want to deal with those things head on, but they don't want to be the person to speak up and be like, can we talk about this?
Right. Okay. Yes. And you bringing it up is the important thing. Like as the, whether if it's a mental practitioner like me coming in or like a coach or something, like you giving them examples. It's like you're giving them the voice. You're like, this is common and normal. And if you give them that stuff, they're like, then they latch on and they like to, finally share their stories too. They're like, oh yeah, I do that too. I get really scared when I have to throw my series on the beam or I have to do my dismounts or whatever they are. And then more people are willing to speak up.
Yeah, right. Giving examples that are not someone on the team, right? Yes. Like hypothetical examples, but also I think this is the role of like really high level athletes, right? Like Simone's been very open about her mental health. Or there's a lot of athletes who have talked about nutrition and mental health and sleeping and the other things. And I think that's why I try to have those people on the podcast, because if other people hear like, oh my gosh, Simone struggles with that. Or like, I think, Sam Pejic came on and she talked about how much of a mental block she had as a kid and how many fears she had. And like, I got so many emails and messages like, my daughter listened to the Sam Pejic episode and she was so relieved to hear that she struggled too. And I think that's a really great way for coaches to do it, is just like you would look for expert technique or someone who's really great at a certain skill. You would also want to highlight those stories about like, well, here's an example of how this person dealt with fear and this is how they got through it, or nutrition or something like that. And I think it's a really good safeguard for them to feel like, oh my gosh, they're just like me, but also I'm not being singled out when we talk about these things, because everyone knows that situation where you unfortunately don't wait to talk about it until it's a problem. And everyone on the team knows that one person who is struggling with fear, and that's why we're talking about it. And it's awkward. It's uncomfortable for them.
Right. Yeah, exactly. So if you make it as a theme that's going on in your gym, then we're not singling those people out. We're not making them feel shame when they're coming into the gym. And then it opens up more opportunity for other people to be like, oh, well, I can talk about it. We're not just talking about that one girl who's always, freaking out about her skills.
Yeah.
It was so great, like, because you're speaking of athletes, like Michaela Skinner just recently said something about how she, even at a young age, knew that failure was an important thing for progress. Because if we don't fail, how are we supposed to progress? But she said, like, the people at the ranch didn't know that. That she's like, I just don't get why they don't, they're so fixated on perfectionism when failure is so important for us to get better. And I just thought that was so interesting that like our, young athletes at the time are thinking about these things, but, our coaches are missing it, or, people who are just well known in the field are missing it.
Yeah, I absolutely want to come back to that concept, because that's super. There's so many type A gymnasts out there that are definitely struggling with that, and coaches too. The other side of the coin I want to talk about too, because, now that we've kind of maybe easily trotted into this question well, but there's no doubt about it that there are so many gyms, unfortunately, still where the coaches are just not approachable. Like, and I deal with this so much on injuries and pain, but I'm sure you hear about fears is that unfortunately they come like a gymnast does have a back problem or some sort of injury or a fear or something is going wrong, and they try to talk to their coach or parent about it. It's not only about coaches, right? They talk to their parent and it's completely blown off, like completely.
Oh, yeah.
like anywhere from you're faking it to no, it doesn't hurt, which is a very toxic thing to say because you're warping their own sense of reality, to just writing them off like, oh, okay, like, well, I guess don't do the numbers, or like, okay, just go do your PT. Like they're very condescending about the way that they do it. And there's so gymnasts that come to me and they say like, okay, well, I tried to tell my coach or my parent or someone about this and I was completely blown off. Or, you know, they just don't know what to do with me. They just get annoyed with me in practice when I'm having a fear, and they kind of focus on their gymnast. So I think I wish I could say this is getting a lot better. It is getting better, but there's still so many places that I think the coaches are really oblivious to the damage that does to a young gymnast when they try to speak up and you break that trust with them the first time. So one, I guess the first question is that something you hear about and talk about, or is that just me being on the unbiased part of the medical part?
No, I mean, I hear that. That's, you know, a huge precursor to mental blocks, is not having that trusting relationship with your coaches. Because in a gym, you have to be very vulnerable to be able to do some of these harder skills. You have to put your faith in your coaches to, you know, to teach you those skills, to kind of save you in a way when you first start those skills, because, you know, you're putting your life in their hands essentially. Literally. And yeah, so, I mean, yeah, that's exactly one of the things that I work with when it comes to mental blocks, because it's just coaches and parents, not all of them, obviously, but there are quite a few that can just minimize what they're saying. And once a coach does that, an athlete doesn't feel safe to come and approach them again and say something. And kids, especially kids, are not going to do that, because they're like, gosh, they told me that nothing was wrong with me. So maybe I'm not, I don't know what I'm saying. Maybe nothing is wrong with me. And not only is that just a problem in the gym, but like having a coach or a parent talk to you in that way when you're young leads to a lot of issues when you become an adult, when you're outside of the sport, when you're trying to get a job, when you're forming relationships, you're kind of confused on what a trusting environment, a safe environment and relationship with people should be like.
Yeah. And I also think very importantly is, especially in the kind of the main age demographic that I work with, is like the 13 to 17 or college age, is that one person tries to approach the coach and kind of gets discredited, and that becomes what everybody talks about. So the gossip of like, yeah, he didn't hear anything. And like they see that interaction where you maybe don't interact the best with that gymnast, and everybody then feels as though you're not approachable. And I think that's something I've heard from coaches that are frustrated. They say like, I don't get it why nobody tells me about their pain. I don't get it why nobody tells me about, something going on. It's like, well, can you think back to any times when maybe you didn't handle it the best way and you wrote somebody off? Maybe you didn't mean it and it just came off like as you discredited someone, or you made an offhanded joke that somebody became embarrassed about and felt bad about because they were the one with pain or who couldn't do the assignment. And now the whole team saw you do that, and now nobody wants to speak to you. And we have some uncomfortable moments of reckoning where they're like, oh yeah, okay, like I maybe see how the whole team became guarded against talking to me. So it spreads, unfortunately, very quickly, like emotional contagion does.
Oh, yeah, definitely. And, I think that one way that, I've talked to people on how they can fix this, whether it's parents or coaches or not, like you can get your group of gymnasts together and you can apologize. Yep. And for adults, I know that's really hard. Like apologizing is something that can be very difficult for anybody. But getting them together and explaining me like, hey, I think that at some point, you guys have noticed that maybe I wasn't approachable for you to come with me with your concerns. So can we discuss that? Like, I want you to come with me for your concerns, and I'm so sorry, that I was not approachable. So I think that's just like a huge move, and that can restore some trust and confidence in you.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's funny because I think most coaches or even most parents or even teammates who have done this before, like maybe they're a team leader or something like that, and they haven't been the most approachable, they think it's a weakness to say, hey, I'm sorry and I made a mistake. They don't want to, bruise that perfection ego fueled, oh, I'm the best and I always know. I've actually found it's the opposite. I've found that when you actually do take the time to say, hey, I screwed up. I'm sorry. I made a mistake. I'm going to try to fix these 3 or 4 things and we'll work better. I think it's the opposite. They actually get way more trust in you, and they're way more inspired by you. Like, wow, like I can't believe you care about me that much where you're willing to say, I'm sorry and I made a mistake. And it actually opens up the doors quite a bit to a lot more productive conversations down the road. The facade is that, be perfect all the time, know all the answers, never have something wrong. But as a coach or as a leader, it's the opposite, I think.
Oh, yeah, I agree. And I really think that showing your vulnerability and that you don't know everything is so important, because then they feel like they don't have to know everything. Because I think just the gymnastics culture in general, we're focused on strength and mental toughness, and just the kind of definitions that we're giving off is that you have to be perfect. Mentally tough means that you aren't vulnerable, that you can, you don't see fear, like you try everything, so when mental toughness really is that you can be vulnerable, like you can share what's going on with you, that you can say that you're scared to do something. Mentally tough doesn't mean that you can just withstand everything. It means that, you can seek that assistance and stuff like that. And I think that's something we need to discuss more, because it's not a weakness. It's not a weakness to show emotions or to discuss, our issues with completing skills, with relationships, whatever it is. Like, we need to talk about that stuff, and that will enhance that trusting relationship, and it'll build confidence in our athletes, which we need for them to do these skills.
Yeah, that trickle down effect is crazy, right? Like it's like we talk about how much they look up to and often spend time with their, coach, between the coaches and their parents, right there. That's a lot of their role modeling comes from that. So as a leader, as someone who's leading a group, if you are willing to say, I don't know, I'm asking for help, or I'm sorry, I made a mistake, that trickles down for them to have the air cover to be like, oh, I can actually speak up about things like that, or I can say I need help or something like that. And I think, again, it's funny you mentioned the thing with Michaela Skinner, which I was unaware of, is that if you're role modeled, and I don't know anything about Michaela, but if you're role modeled with the people at the ranch or elsewhere that, they always had to be right, they never did anything wrong, they never admitted they were like something went mistake or awry, and they always kind of had that bullish, I know everything attitude. Well, then they think as a gymnast growing up, like, I always have to be perfect. I can never show weakness. I can never say I'm scared. I have to always push through. But if the opposite happens, and we see many examples of this, like Amy Borman, for example, Nick Ruddick, who coached like, no, I don't know everything. I need to ask for help. I made a mistake. I'm sorry. It allows the gymnasts who work with them and under them to say like, wow, I can't believe that Amy would ask for help from somebody else. I guess it's okay for me to say, I don't know what to do here. Can you help me out? And that like mentality and that type of value system then trickles throughout the entire coaching staff, and you watch somebody else do that. And it becomes a place where, you don't need to be perfect all the time, and you can ask for help, and it's okay to say, I'm nervous, or I'm struggling here. Can somebody please give me a hand?
Yeah, no, I agree. And perfectionism, it's just not attainable. So it's, right. Why are we trying to instill this kind of, this mentality in our gymnasts, especially, if a lot of our gymnasts aren't going to be going to the Olympics, or they're not going to be elite, gymnastics and sports and just in general are supposed to teach us a lot of those life skills. And we don't need to be teaching perfectionism, because just think of how, perfection impacts your relationships, impacts your, your jobs when you get older. You're never going to feel fulfilled. And that's not something, we want to be putting on young minds that aren't even really capable of trying to process that kind of information.
Yeah, it's crazy that we're going to this topic, because I've talked with a lot of gymnasts more recently. I think as things have progressed with, the changes that are happening in cultures, a lot of gymnasts have talked to me more about like things that they struggled with. And one thing is that idea of perfection and never coming close to meeting it, right? Because you're never, ever going to come close to meeting it. A lot of young gymnasts start to feel as though something is wrong with them. Like if they have fears, or if they can't get a skill, or if they're not competing well, or they can't make a level, they're like, well, something must be wrong with me. I must be defective in somehow. Something is wrong with, either my gymnastics or the way that I was born or something. And they feel terrible about the fact that they can't attain this insane standard that nobody can attain, right? Even the best gymnast in the world, right? Probably Simone right now will tell you that that's impossible to get perfect all the time and make that. So it puts you on this hamster wheel of success where it's never good enough. And you start to develop these just insane, unrelenting standards for yourself that you're never good enough. You always have to be more. And I think it goes in one zig to like body image. And I've talked about with some nutritionist friends, like I'm never lean enough. I'm never strong enough, all the way to the mental stuff. Like you said, I'm just not tough enough. I'm not working hard enough. And it just buries athletes. It just buries young athletes, and it becomes huge problems in their gymnastics career. But so many ex-gymnasts I talk with that are friends, or now I connect with for trying to do some cultural reform stuff. That's like, that was the reason why I fell apart after college, or I fell apart in the real world, because I never thought I was good enough, and I was always insecure. And it was kind of the seed of that was planted in 12-year-old me trying to be perfect all the time, and getting guilted or shamed when I wasn't good enough. And I think it's an uncomfortable topic that's happening in gymnastics, but it's really a huge problem.
No, yeah, I completely agree. And, the same thing like even happened with my gymnastics career. I got injured when I was younger, and my elbow kept hyperextending, and then it would end up popping out. And that was just kind of something that I could never really fix at the time. And I remember one time when I left the gym and I was sitting on the side because I got injured, and my coach kind of kept looking over at me, and I didn't know what I was supposed to be doing. I was like, I thought he was mad at me because I got hurt. So I ended up just getting down on the floor and starting doing, ab conditioning, because I was like, he probably thinks I'm being lazy over here. So the impact of those things, and, and when you get older, thinking, worrying about what people think, always being people pleasers or whatever it is, there's this vicious cycle of how these things happen.
It's tough. And do you see, I don't know, I don't know the range of people you work with age-wise, but do you see as though that is a common theme, that like it starts when maybe they're younger and they're in that environment and sticks with them, or is it something that only develops in the younger age?
No, I think it can happen at any age, but the youngest child I've worked with is 5, but my history is actually working in trauma and crisis. So a lot of the kids that I have worked with, especially when I started, is working with abuse, neglect, domestic violence. I've worked with, the moms who are domestic violence victims, and I actually worked in the prison system too. And I worked with the male side of it too, on the male mental health unit, and working with, their trauma and crisis of like inflicting it and receiving it at the same time. So with the kids, the youngest I've worked with is 5, and I've gone up to, I think my oldest has been like 60 some years old that I've worked with when it comes to like these issues. And it's, a lot of times when they're young, and even the older men have told me that how they've been treated when they were young impacted how they thought about themselves their entire life, and, how they've struggled with emotional stability, or, relationships, job satisfaction, whatever it's been. It's a lot of it's originated from when they were children.
That's fascinating. That's a wild thing to go from like the prison background to also working in gymnastics, then the 5 to 60. That's quite the spectrum.
Yes, it is. Yeah, because I wanted to keep my options open on kind of where I landed, and I have a very big interest in populations when it comes to mental health issues, just from like people I've known and what I've experienced in my own life. So it's been kind of a roundabout way of getting to gymnastics.
Yeah, I'm sure all this, my work in general population with a lot of other things was massively helpful to help me as like a gymnastics provider. So I'm sure it might be the same with you, whereas the wider range of experiences you can draw from, the better you can be in your one given field, right?
Oh yeah, yes.
And the other thing I wanted to wrap up, it's stuck in my mind still, is I want to go back and kind of button up the approachable conversation thing. So for gymnasts that you work with that are maybe having that, I can't speak up, I'm nervous, to maybe a coach who's a little bit standoffish, what is your recommendation to those gymnasts you work with for how to approach that situation? Because we have to talk about it. We have to talk about either their fears or their pain or something like that. So what are you saying to those gymnasts who really feel stuck? Because a lot of the parents will message me and say like, I want to talk about this, but the coach just refuses to have this conversation, or like brushes me off every time.
Okay. So, if the coach is not, receptive, if we can't get them to work with us, then that's pretty difficult. But a lot of times it's trying, to find the specific time to do it. You don't want to be going up in the middle of practice, when your coach is spotting someone on, vault or whatever, or on the bars, and you want to make sure you could, doing it before practice, doing it after practice. If there's like a break when people are going to get a drink, and you can even go up to them and say, hey, I was wondering if I can talk to you about something. Is there a time that would work best for you? Whether it's you and your parents come in at a different time when you're not even practicing on a different day or morning or something. I think trying to make it convenient for the coach so they're in the right mindset, I think that's important. And so you are too. We don't want to be doing anything like, if your coach looks like they're irritated or frustrated or something, that's not the time to approach them.
Yeah. Yeah, very well said. And you took the words out of my mouth, because I'm empathetic towards coaches, knowing what the reality of trying to run a group of 20 kids is. It's like a lot of coaches have the intention of, I want to listen, I want to hear you. But like, if I spend 20 minutes right now at a 45-minute rotation with you, I'm unfortunately taking away from the safety and the concerns of everybody else. So I think as a coach, I know all too well that if somebody comes to me and says like, hey, I had this issue I'd like to talk about, can we find time before practice, after practice? Like, can we jump on a Zoom call, something? I think that for me, I know that that's a much better situation where I can like just separate myself from the busyness of coaching and figure that out. So yeah, that's always my recommendation as well, is trying to find a time to get a separate place and kind of discuss this openly with whoever you need. And the other thing I would offer that I think helps a lot of parents and gymnasts is kind of have like a hierarchy of how you address the problem. Like try to talk to that person directly one-on-one. Like most people ask me, they're like, how do I deal with this person? I'm like, have you had a face-to-face meeting just talking about the real issue honestly? And they're like, oh man, no, that's stressful. And I'm like, okay, well, let's start there. You got to have a hard conversation. It's a skill to learn that. But you can also, if someone just refuses to hear what you're saying, you do have to kind of move up the chain of command and talk to like a head coach and say like, okay, I tried to talk to this person, but they're really not open to it. Can we have this conversation? Then you go to a gym owner, then you go all the way up. And if someone, you get all the way up the ladder and is not hearing your concerns, or that person is the gym owner, you have to ask like, is this a right fit? Like, is this a good fit for me? That if someone can't hear any of my concerns and doesn't want to talk about it, this is not a good fit for me and my daughter or my son or me as whatever. And it's hard because I know gyms are spread out sometimes and it's far to go, but if you can't have a simple conversation about things with injuries or fears, like you only are waiting for headaches down the road when bigger problems erupt.
Oh, right. And then, I mean, if you can't even have a conversation with, your coach because that environment may not be, conducive to this communication, I mean, what's going to happen when you're trying to do harder skills? Like, do you have that faith in them to be there for you? So it's just, if you can't even communicate, then what else is going on? So yeah, sometimes you have to make those changes. But most of the time, I think, like you said, like coaches are usually pretty receptive of it. It's just when we approach them and, if it's something that is happening in the moment, as a coach, maybe having your athlete sit down on the side and just be like, hey, take some deep breaths, like try to calm down right now. And I will talk to you between rotations, just for a few minutes, we can discuss it. And then we can figure out a time when we can actually have a conversation. So it's like, you're not ignoring them. You're acknowledging that something's going on, but we're just going to save it for a different time.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we're definitely spot on here for advice. One is you have to find the right context and time, but also the majority of coaches do not like being blindsided. I think there's unfortunately times when people don't speak up. They talk to them behind the scenes. And I've gotten in the middle of this, unfortunately, like someone will come to me for an injury and talk to me about their injuries, their problems and stuff, but their coach is really unaware of the fact this happens. So like, when I finally reach out and say like, hey, this person's been having this problem, can we talk about it? Like, I had no idea. Like, I didn't hear about this until like right now. And as a coach, that's very stressful to not be in the loop. So you have to be proactive in talking about things right as they happen. I think a lot of gymnasts, unfortunately, they have a coach who's approachable and they really want to do it. But again, they're embarrassed about being hurt in front of their teammates. They're embarrassed about having a mental block. They don't want people gossiping about them and they don't speak up about it. And then 2 months down the road, it blows up in their face. And so that's probably more of a problem on the gymnast needs to be counseled to like, hey, you have to speak up when, things start and not let them fester under the rug for a while. Yeah.
And talking about how we say these things, I think, that's what, I was saying earlier about communication. It's so important to have communication, but how are we talking to one another? Like, what's our tone of voice sound like? How are we saying these phrases to our gymnasts, or gymnasts, how are we saying these to our coaches? Are we approaching them and are we kind of yelling at them like, hey, listen to me kind of thing? So we need to kind of focus on these soft startups so we can have good conversations and figure out, and what I might be saying exactly what I mean, but it might be a little harsh. It might be a little blunt. So like just rephrasing how we do things.
Yeah. And I think you remember you were saying you're very passionate about trying to help kids have that emotional vocabulary. And does that mean, just so I'm clear, like having the words to accurately describe the emotions they're feeling? Because I don't remember, as a researcher from Yale, I was reading about like, it's like this grid where you go through and you have different like heightened senses of like, I'm alert or not, or I'm sad or I'm not, but giving specific semantics to the real thing you're feeling versus like, I'm sad, like, I'm frustrated. Like you have to be very specific about the emotions you feel to help kind of share and communicate with someone. Is that what you're talking about, or am I off the mark there?
No, that's right. And when, when we're talking about emotions, it's how does that emotion feel to you? And how does that evolve into a different emotion? Because a lot of times they just think, I'm angry, but they didn't know that sadness or loneliness or fear or something was a precursor to that anger. Right. So discussing how emotions can flow through one another, how they feel within our body, those physiological cues, and then we go through what can trigger those things. So we can actually kind of see the whole process of how an emotion evolves and how that feels for them.
Got it. Yeah, that's awesome. And then I think the other piece I wanted to kind of touch on before we move on to definitely go back to perfectionism is as coaches or parents or people who are maybe the adults in the situation, what can they do to foster these conversations with younger athletes, especially because I think it's hard sometimes to pry out, I just think of the classic example, like how was school? Good. How was practice? Fine. All right. Good conversation. You know what I mean? Like it's very hard to pry out of especially a teenager who's maybe doesn't want anything to do with adults at that time. But how do you foster getting some of those conversations to come to light? Because I think a lot of people want to have those conversations, but they're the ones who are kind of getting met with a wall when they try to have.
Well, we just need to change your question. So how's school? Good. So we're asking a closed-ended question there. So they only, we're giving them the opportunity to just say one thing about it. It was good or it was bad.
Yeah.
So saying, like, tell me something good about school today. Tell me what you did today. Tell me how your test went. Like, just trying to make those questions a little bit more open so they actually have to say something to you. And then you can kind of create that dialogue.
Yeah. And it goes all the way back to on the coaching side too, when you're trying to break down like a mental block, which I want to get back to as well, is asking an open-ended question about that, not just like, are you scared? Yes. It's like, okay, not going to go well. But if you ask like, is there something specific about this that you're worried about? And they say like, and you give them options. Like, are you on a flyaway is like one of the most classic ones. Are you worried about hitting the bar? Are you worried about peeling off? Are you worried about, something else happening? And if you give them a range of options to think about or leave it open-ended, they can fill in the gap with something. And then you keep breaking down those things a little bit more and more versus just like you said, the black or white answer.
Right. Yeah. Giving them the options is really great, especially, for little kids, because they're like, I don't really know what it is that specifically scares me about this, but something does. Yeah. Asking them those open-ended questions, like, saying you can even kind of give them an emotion. Sometimes like people are a little leery about doing that, but if you say, I can tell, like, you look anxious to me today, or you look stressed today. Can you tell me what's been going on? Or if you see they're doing a specific skill and they're looking frustrated, hey, so I can tell there's a lot of frustration going on. What about this skill right now is frustrating you? What's going on? So, and then the biggest thing I think that we do as adults is we don't listen. So once we ask that question, just stop talking and give them that opportunity to speak, because a lot of times they have to think about it, because these questions are things, sometimes they haven't thought about. So they really need to kind of rack it in their brain to figure out what to say. And then we have to give them that space, because a lot of times we fill in their sentences for them. They're like, yeah, this is, I'm doing, I'm missing my hands this time. And then they'll fill it in, so we don't want to continue their sentences, finish their phrases, let them talk.
Yeah, I think that for many people, it's a skill that I struggled with, was the allowing for negative space, or like an open, just blank nothingness. I think sometimes that empty space feels uncomfortable. And when you're in the moment, 3 seconds feels like 8 minutes. But in reality, like there's a lot of times when if I'm either working with an athlete, I'll just be like, well, what do you think about this? And it's like, and they don't want to say anything, and you just let them, just let it sit there for a while. You know what I mean? Like, don't be afraid to rush the conversation along, because once they realize that you're not going anywhere and you're here and you're not on your cell phone and you're not like distracted and you just sit there and listen, people oftentimes will come out with like the hint of something. Then you pull on that thread a little bit more, like, okay, tell me more about that. Or you pull on the next one. And I think, I don't know whether this is just a modern society busyness pace that we have. Like oftentimes people I notice feel they have to always be saying something at all times in a conversation versus just sitting there and just letting it happen.
That's my favorite thing to do in therapy is silence.
Yeah.
I've actually done sessions when I've worked inpatient with kids where they said they didn't want to talk. And I'm like, that's completely fine. I am good with sitting here in silence. And I literally just sit there with them. Yeah. And it can be 15, 30 minutes, and then they finally start talking. But it's letting them know that they're important. And silence just makes people uncomfortable.
It does.
And especially if we're the ones who are allowing it. We're like, oh my gosh, I have to fill this space, because what am I supposed to do with silence? And yes, I think it has a lot to do with our cell phones and social media. We're constantly, being stimulated, and we just really don't know how to just be with ourselves.
Yeah. And just time to think, right? Like time to pause in a conversation and think about the question that you've been asked, or, the multiple factors that might go into an answer. Like just having like, it's like, okay to sit there for a minute and just contemplate your answer. Like if you have someone on the phone or you're talking to someone, like, is 1 minute out of your 30-minute conversation to get a really good answer going to be a problem? Like, no, you're probably using that time well. Let's go back to perfectionism now, because I want to go perfectionism and then definitely mental blocks. But I think we're jumping all over the place, but it's good. On the perfectionist side, I think that we talked about maybe why it happens in terms of like the culture that doesn't really appreciate failure and doesn't appreciate the fact that it's never going to be right. But I think it's very, it's hard as a coach to dance that line, because you want to encourage excellence and you want to encourage high quality work, but you also don't want someone to feel paralyzed by failure and paralyzed by that perfectionism. So what do you hear from clients from the gymnastics side that are things you commonly hear about? Like, is it skills that kids are worried about perfection? Is it meets? Is it impressing someone? Like, what is the nature and context of their perfectionism? How does that manifest?
I think it's all of that. It just depends on, you know, the kid or who I'm working with. Um, you know, the pleasing, I think, is really something that they struggle with when it comes to perfectionism. Like they want, it's like they're not doing gymnastics for themselves. They're doing it for the coaches or for their parents. Also the being left behind when it comes to teammates. They're always watching other teammates and thinking that they're being perfect, even though, you know, they're not using that realistic thinking about it, because they're just like, oh, they are perfect. They're always doing everything correct. So that's another thing. And then just, I think it's difficult with our sport because everything is a deduction. You know, just your toes, your legs, like your lines and how you do things. Like those are all deductions. And in a way, the sport just kind of breeds perfectionism by itself, because we look at those deductions. You know, if you're looking through your book that do the code of points, like, especially as the athlete, you see all these things. You're like, oh my gosh, that's like this much is taken off for something like this.
Yeah.
So trying to help them know that yes, that happens, but that doesn't mean, you know, you can't do that every once in a while. You know, it's not that big a deal.
Yeah, that's an interesting concept, right? The concept of you have a starting score and you're chipping away at it versus you're earning points as you go more and more. I think that definitely that wears on your mental health as you're constantly like one little thing goes wrong, like, oh, there we go, out the tank. Like every gymnast knows, like you do one thing wrong in the first skill of 10, you're like, well, there goes that routine, and the rest of the routine, you're like, oh, that sucked, that wasn't good enough, nope, not good. And that's the next thing that comes to my mind is I can't tell you how many people I know struggle. Just the biggest war they have is between their own ears. It has nothing to do with their coaches are great, they support them, and their parents are awesome, they support them, but man, that perfectionist mentality is just breeds this like chaos inside their head about like, I'm never good enough, I don't like this, I always fall in this skill. And so I'd love to hear your thoughts on, I mean, I guess we all know that gymnasts clearly probably struggle with negative self-talk and stuff like that, but I'm curious about your thoughts on maybe how to help that, because a lot of gymnasts struggle with, it's never good enough, I always suck, like brutal things they say to themselves. It's not about anybody else. And I struggle with that so much as a younger gymnast. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah. So building that confidence is one of the important things that I do. And I'm constantly doing that throughout all my sessions when I'm working with gymnasts, is you do subtle things on getting them to kind of rewire those tracks in your brains. Because, you know, you get negative thoughts. It's like, I always say as an example of like, if you ride your bike on the same line over and over and over again, what happens to the line? Like it gradually gets deeper into the ground. Yeah. And that's kind of what negative thoughts do to our brain. So we're trying to like get out of that hole that they've been digging and trying to rewire things. And so getting them to just talk about the things that they've been doing well is important. So I don't even ask them sometimes like, what didn't go well today? Like I ask them, what went well today? You know, what do you think you do well on beam, bars, vault, whatever it is? Like, what are you proud of yourself? So trying to, you know, be grateful, show pride in what you do, and build that confidence, not just in your skills, but in who you are. Like, what are personality characteristics that you like about yourself? And how do you show these things to other people? And what do other people see in you that they like about you? So a lot of times it's trying to not like trick them into being positive, but kind of.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think, as you mentioned, the sport as a culture, even with awesome coaches who mean well and parents who mean well, unfortunately, it comes down to that like crowd pleasing, right? It comes down to impress the coach, please your parents, impress the judge, get the score, your teammates. Like I think the sport unfortunately gears people towards constantly wanting to impress other people instead of authentically being proud of your own efforts and of your own attitudes. And I think personally, as I've gone through the coaching and kind of, especially on the journey of trying to help athletes, is I try to nip those things in the bud when they happen about like, well, I just want to make you happier, I just want to impress you. I'm like, whoa, this is not about impressing me. Like this is not at all for me or anything. Like this is about you impressing yourself, because these type A, very hyper perfectionist athletes we usually have, they are the hardest ones to impress. Like to authentically be proud of themselves, way bigger of a feat than impressing people at the gym as coaches or getting all these things on social media, like TikTok, Instagram, like stuff like that. Like it's way more about, chances are if you can impress yourself and authentically be proud of yourself, that is going to be the biggest win. I think that shift of trying to pull out internal motivation or intrinsic motivation of like what really impressed you about this. Like it could be like, well, I did this after I totally ate it on beam. I got back up and I did one more, or I hit this routine that I worked my butt off for. I think the more as a sport that we can shift things away from the score, the people, the social media into just like what makes you legitimately happy about what you did with yourself. I think you shift that model and it promotes that like, oh, wow, I actually am good at these things and I have some things I'm awesome at. And I think that's very important for gymnasts to learn how to impress themselves and be happy with themselves instead of pleasing other people.
Yeah. And I love that you said that you kind of redirect the conversation and they're like, I want to please you. And you're like, no, I want you to please yourself. I want you to be proud of yourself. Or, you know, what did you do during this like turn that you can be proud of? So yeah, just redirecting how they think about themselves, because they're, especially kids, they want their coaches to be so proud of them and their parents to be so proud of them, but they don't remember or don't even know that they're supposed to be proud of themselves. So yeah, I'm like changing those thoughts, because a lot of times they don't even think about it. They're like, what do you mean be proud of myself? Like, what do you mean I did something well? Like, it's very hard for them to think of it sometimes. So we have to start out really small.
Yeah, particularly if they've come up, unfortunately, in an environment where it was constantly, you know, not good enough, you did this wrong, fix this or that and that. I think they get that only negative connotation mentality. And I've learned from a couple of the coaches on the podcast, which is great too, which is like, it's not only always about praising or critiquing skills themselves, like effort and attitude go a long way. So like you could be eating it left and right and not having a great day on bars. But if you're still in there and you're working and you're trying to fix this, like that, in my opinion, deserves more praise, because the days will come and go that some days you're not feeling it and it's not going well. And other days when you feel like you're on top of the moon, but as long as you can try to reframe your attitude and always be putting in the work, I think that's more praiseworthy than just like, oh, you actually hit your handstand or good job catching this release or something like that.
And, you know, giving them that praise of like, hey, just try it again, do it again, you're fine. It's, you know, how do we respond when they bail, or, you know, when they completely crash doing something? You know, if we get angry at them for them, that's, you know, that's when they get scared. They're like, oh gosh, I can't mess up. And that kind of breeds that perfectionist attitude, because we're not encouraging them like, oh, it's okay, you messed up, think about it, try to fix it and try again.
Yeah. And I think that just popped in my mind. I was just writing to someone about this, but I think the other thing we have to be really careful of with gymnastics is to constantly more go, busy, more hours, more reps, more time, more practice, get it all in. I think that doesn't really, like we just said, how important that time and that space is to think. I think when you have a situation where you're like, do the assignment, go do this drill, go do this faster, stop talking, go, you lose the space and time to think and reflect about like, okay, why did I just fall? Like, what is not going well? How do I back this up? And I think whether it's with conversation, whether it's with video review, whether it's just by giving them some time to like think about it, I think sometimes the quality over quantity approach, or the smarter, not harder approach, is good. Like there's definitely times when like, yeah, five beam series more is what you need. But I think a lot of times the kids just feel the pressure to constantly be busy, and it just makes it look like it's hard, but they don't actually have reflection or conversation. And it gets into this mindset of, I'm always stressed, I'm always running, I can't actually critically think.
Right. I love the quality over quantity thing, because if, you know, obviously if you have your gymnast do 6 turns with something that they're working on, and let's say the last one was awful and they're like, just let me do it again. Just let me do it again. And you're like, no, you did your 6, because I want you to think about it. I want you to reflect on it. And I want you to be focused when you do your 6. So, it's changing how they think about their skills and their series and whatever they're doing, and they're being more focused with the limited amount of, you know, time that they have with those things. Because, you know, the more they do it, the more they're not thinking about it. They're just starting to throw things and chuck it, and we don't want that. We want it to, we want them to be tight. We want them to be safe. And I think that smaller amount of, you know, skills is important for that.
Yeah, the time and the space to like have that to think, but then also I think like as a coach, it's an art form of learning, kind of like a mental health counselor, is how to probe them to talk about the situation and kind of tease out what they think is going on. I think far too often we want to give the answer, fix the thing, get it right away. And it's well-intentioned. We just want to give them the tools to get better, instead of being like, okay, well, maybe we landed short on that, you know, into the pit, whatever else is, like, what would cause that? Like, what about where our arms go, where our head goes? And I think the same kind of reflection on fear sometimes is really important. It's like, okay, you're scared of hitting your feet in the bar. What would cause us to hit our feet on the bar? What are some things you can think about, even if they're wrong? You know, at least they're just guessing. And I think sometimes coaches and adults and people, I think that's a skill set we can develop more, is not just giving them the answer, but allowing them to kind of like kind of walk through the waters there and figure out what's going on, I think that builds a lot more of that critical thinking stuff they need to grow up.
Oh yeah, and I think it builds that trust too, because they're like, oh wow, they're really willing to listening to me. But I think like a big thing that sometimes we do not, obviously if you're listening, most people do a good job with it, but we want to make sure that we're not shaming them with some of their answers. Because sometimes, kids will, or athletes will say something to us and we're just like, that was a really bad answer. No. Yeah. And then they're not going to want to process with you anymore. They're not going to want to use those critical thinking skills. And so we want to make sure that we're being kind when they may be throwing out some answers that we're like, that's not true, but good job.
Yeah. And I think we definitely are hitting well on like what can happen. I mean, I'm sure like teaching athletes about the things we talked about is important with like shifting your focus and thinking inside. But as coaches, as parents, as people who in medical providers too, who are often interacting with these hyper perfectionist gymnasts, what are some things that they can do on the other side of this to foster an environment where like perfection is not the only standard we have to attain? Like, I think excellence is probably a better perfection than perfection, and progress is better than perfection. But I think a lot of times coaches are like, I'm trying hard to make this like not about going crazy and being so stressed out, but the kids just refuse to have a different approach. So are there things that coaches or parents and stuff can do also to kind of promote that?
Yeah, I think that, well, I guess let's start with coaches, because I think that in the gym, like a lot of the stuff that we've been talking about, like just try it again, encouraging them and thinking about, knowing which athletes are perfectionists for one, and how we communicate with them. We might have to do it a little bit different than we do with other athletes sometimes. So, and it's not saying being softer or anything, but just how do we communicate with them? What are we saying to them? I'm trying to think of a good example of how to talk to them, but making sure that we're not focusing on that perfectionist attitude, when we're discussing progressions with them.
Right. Yeah. And I always think about like, I have a couple gymnasts in my mind, but maybe this would be a good example is, don't make a pirouette, get really frustrated, make a pirouette. Well, it's still not good enough. My legs are still apart. Or like make a pirouette. Okay, but now it's like this. Or like, okay, but yeah, I don't have my giant yet. And like they jump right to the next thing. Even if something does go well and it's really, really good, they jump immediately to the next thing that's not good enough, or the next thing that they have to work on, or, oh, it's just luck, right? Like when things go wrong, they attribute it to their own personal problem. But then when things go right and they hit the routine of their life, they say, oh, it's just lucky. Like that'll never happen again. Like they're always like discounting the positive, just focusing only on the negative. So that's what I see a lot. I'm not sure if that's kind of what the example you're trying to pull from is.
Yeah, actually, that was a really good example. Thank you for your help.
From the trenches.
No, I appreciate it. No, that's exactly right. Like, so when they're jumping to a new skill, it's good to redirect them back. They're like, well, we're not talking about that right now. We're talking about this skill and what you did in this moment. So we want to try to be present when we're working on our certain skills. So I know you don't think that this pirouette was perfect, but what was good about it? And then kind of just trying to pull them back to, what did you see that was good? You had to have done something well because you landed it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I always think too, I think sometimes it's very easy. This is just human nature, but it's very easy to lose sight of where you've come from to where you are now. And so I think a lot of athletes, for example, the one I'm thinking of is like, took forever to get a cast handstand. For some reason, it was just like growing and puberty was tough and stuff like that. So she was younger, it just didn't happen. But then she got a cast handstand, and then she wanted to get a pirouette, and then she got a pirouette, then she got a kip cast handstand, pirouette, very smooth, feet up. And she was working through. But as soon as we had the one thing done that we worked so hard to get for, we jumped to the next thing. And that was the frustrating point. So going back to like, let's just take a step back and think about like 2 months ago, you could barely connect 5 kip cast handstands in a row, and you were super frustrated with that. But like, not even a problem. That's in the warm up right now. Like you're not having an issue. And like now you're doing 3 pirouettes in a row. Like now you're doing this. So I think as you reflect on where they've come from to get to where they are, sometimes that's better to look at, right? Like the old adage of like, look how far you've come versus how much far you go. I think a lot of gymnasts are constantly just looking uphill versus like looking back like, wow, yeah, I used to not be able to do one single cast handstand. Now I do 5 in a warm up. And like, that's pretty good.
Oh, yeah, no, I completely agree. And every gymnast is different. So like having so many ideas of how to talk to them and how to work with them is so important, because, they do, but they'll look back at those skills and be like, oh, well, that was hard, but it's not as hard as this skill.
Right.
But
or Susie over there is doing a double full and I'm just doing a single full.
Yes, exactly. So yeah, making them take that step back, remembering not to compare themselves to others. Like, well, we're not talking about Susie, we're talking about you and what you've done and how you're progressing. And then reminding them, like, yes, Susie may be doing this, but we're not, we're not comparing ourselves. We're very different athletes. So trying to not allow them to do those things. Well, that's nice. Yes, Susie's doing that great. But let's come back to what you're doing.
Yeah. And there's also that, I think I'm glad we talked on comparison, because I think a lot of gymnasts themselves hyper compare, and it's always like the source of their misery is that it's never enough as Susie or this person on Instagram or blah, blah, blah. Like you can always find someone who's better at you than something, like all the time. So if you just constantly live in the world of like, especially like in different events, right? Like there's a couple athletes I've worked with where like just floor and vault wasn't for them, but bars, man, whew, like picked up skills super fast. And I remember talking to one athlete about like, she's like, oh, well, this person got a 1.5 punch on floor and I'm still stuck at just a full blah, blah, blah. And I was like, yeah, but you learn to straddle back in like a week, like literally a week. This person has a different strength and weakness than you do. So like, well, they're excelling somewhere, you're maybe excelling elsewhere. It's just the way we're designed. Some people are better at other things, and some people have natural predispositions to get things faster. But like, if you only focus on all the things that other people are doing better than you, you're pretty much going to find a way to make yourself miserable for all events all the time. So like, you have to take a step back and be like, all right, like, well, they might be great at this, but like, I do have these things that are a little bit better for me. And it really shouldn't even be an issue with looking at what other people want, because they have different lives than you. They have different goals. They have different, aspirations and histories and stuff like that.
Oh yeah, it's that grass is greener on the other side always. We always want what we don't have kind of thing. And I think I love your example, because I just went through with, working with a client about something like this when they were, upset about an event, and they're saying, "What this other person never has issues on this event. They're so great on this event, and I don't know why I can't be great." And then I redirect them. I'm like, "Well, what event do you think you're great at?" And then they'll tell me, and then I'll be like, "Well, do you think this other person that you're talking about, are they really good at that event that you think you're good at?" And she kind of stopped, and she was like, "I mean, I guess she does kind of struggle on that event a little bit. I never really thought about it." And I was like, "Well, see, just because someone's really good at one event doesn't mean that they're excelling in another event. We all have strengths and weaknesses. Maybe you can just learn from that person and figure out, how are they so successful on this event? Is it a mindset? Is it like, are they really focused on their drills? Did they do really well with progressions? What was it? Like, having those conversations and trying to foster that between our teammates, I think, is really important, so that, they can start to not compare one another. They're actually giving each other advice on what they're doing.
Yeah. And it's so important too, as coaches, but then also with those athletes themselves, is to be able to think about that mindset shift of going like, I'm always doing wrong. This. You can study somebody else without being comparative. And that's a hard thing for coaches to do, because coaches oftentimes want to be like, well, look at this girl. She has an amazing Yurchenko block. And like, we'd like to study what she's doing well to help other people be successful. But it comes out as like, be more like Jill. Like, Jill has a great Yurchenko, and everyone's like, and they groan about it. But you can study really high level gymnastics, like look at videos and look at people who are doing them well, and look at like, let's look at the technique of what's going well. What could we study and learn from this? It's very different than, we need to be more like this person. If you were just like this person, that's when you would get your Yurchenko all the way around. I think that's a hard thing to sometimes do well as a coach, and as someone who's trying to, and parents do that too as well, right? Like trying to compare and stuff like that, but mean well, but sometimes that comparison mindset just makes a lot of headaches for people.
Yes, exactly. It can make you feel really bad about yourself.
Yes.
So I love the idea of taking people outside of the gym, maybe like an elite athlete or an Olympian or something, and showing, how they do skills. But also, even, if you're talking about a skill, take someone who's not the best at it at that moment and show them, like, show everybody. And like, if you like shaping, like, I love shaping. I think that's like the best thing, is like showing them gradually as they go through things sometimes. And, showing it on somebody different instead of the person who's the best on it. Just so we're not saying like, we're always using Jill as our demo,
And the other piece of it too, is you can just compare within themselves, right? Like, all athletes that are trying a skill, or even on the medical side who are trying to get better at something, it's like, they're going to have a range of positive and negative attempts, right? They're going to be some that are great, some that are not so great, some that are awesome. So you can kind of compare, be like, okay, well, what did you do last Tuesday when your flyweight felt amazing, that it was going well and you weren't nervous? Like, where were your arms? Where was your head? Where were you looking? Where were you tapping? Versus today, we're struggling. We're riding the struggle bus hard. Is there a difference in where our arms are, our head is? And I think within gymnast comparison like that, I'd be like, well, here's what was going well. Here's what you did to make that happen. Here's the consequence of that. Here's how it's not going well. Sometimes getting within that, even if it's small things, like just a little bit higher of a cast or a little bit better of a block angle or something like that, it puts them in their own head of one, oh, I do this well sometimes or better sometimes, and I don't have to worry about what everybody else is doing.
Right. And to remember that, a lot of the outside stressors affects how we're performing in the gym. Right. So if we're having a hard time at school, or, we got in an argument with our parents or with our boyfriend, or, with just friends, we're having difficulties, that stuff really impacts how well you're doing in the gym. And whether you're not getting sleep, like that sleep hygiene stuff that we talked about, like all of that is so important in how we perform. And just to remember that it's not just because you just can't get that skill that one day. There's a lot of things that could be impacting it, and to give ourselves grace when it comes to that, and just to remember, like, oh, I have a lot going on. I'm very stressed, and that could be why, I'm not doing as well today.
Yeah, for sure. And I think there's another thing that comes up with this idea of comparison, negative self-talk, all that. I think one of the more powerful tools that I've learned from friends of mine who are therapists is a lot of these athletes have best friends or friends on the gym or in the gym that they're working with. And the things they say to themselves, they would never say to their best friend or to the other stuff, right? Like, I think that's important to teach them that kind of like double standard technique, which I think is really great, is like, okay, what are you saying to yourself right now? Like, oh, I suck on this event. I'm never doing this well. I'm terrible at gymnastics. Like, because you're struggling on one event or one thing or one possible. I'm like, okay, your best friend over here, she's struggling on one skill on this event. It's not going well. She's not having a good day. Would you go over and be like, hey man, you suck. You know what I mean? Like, you suck. You're really bad at gymnastics. You should probably just quit. I think that's probably a good idea. Like, you'd be so cruel. You'd be so miserable. So it's like, why would you say that to yourself? And I think I've had a lot of eyeballs open when I'm like, yeah, I don't know if you'd be the best friend if you said that to your friend over there struggling. And I think, you wouldn't say that to yourself opens up a lot of doors for them about like how brutal they're being on themselves, from like wrapping up everything we're talking about, perfectionism and negative comparison, all that kind of stuff. I want to talk about mental blocks, kind of wrap things up, because I know obviously everybody deals with this so much. And I think post pandemic ending, COVID, all that kind of stuff, I had a lot of people who were like, I all of a sudden can't go backwards. I can't do this. I lost all my skills, all that kind of stuff. And so I'd love to hear, I think we talked about why they come up. We were talking about, like just the natural progression of gymnastics getting more challenging, but are there other things that you hear, or you think I should say, that mental blocks maybe come from and they cause? And then I want to talk about how we can maybe help people with them.
Yeah. COVID is, when we're getting out of COVID now, like people forget kind of what the impact of COVID was, because we're like, oh yes, we're so excited that we're getting back to normal and doing, our stuff. But, being at home for that long, and especially as a gymnast, you're not training, we have these expectations to come back that we're going to have the exact same skills, that we're going to be able to perform the same way. We're going to have the same strength and conditioning, and that's not true. Like, you lose that stuff so quickly. And I think, even as coaches, sometimes we forget that when our gymnasts are coming back in, that we try to throw them back into the same things. And I know we don't want to, but even starting back with those progressions, I think are really important, in doing those drills that may seem really easy, but I think that's really important when it's coming back, because that'll help prevent those mental blocks. And I know that sometimes we accelerate, like, if we want a gymnast to get a back tuck on the beam, and so we have them do it like twice on the low beam, they've landed that, they're like, oh, that's great, so try it on the high beam. So just because we're trying to accelerate some things, because we're getting back into season and training, we're going to start seeing more of those mental blocks, because they're not prepared. They're not, physically and mentally prepared. And I think that's a huge thing when it comes to COVID, and remembering that this is not normal. We normally don't have a pandemic. We don't normally get, locked in our homes for months, and that we need to be patient when we're trying to get back into this, and not push our gymnasts or ourselves faster than we can, because it would prevent injury as well, because we don't need them coming to see you guys. So
exactly. Yeah. So with that in mind, as a coach, as well-intentioned, Bobby, what should we not do when someone is struggling with a mental block, or is not going for something, or has a fear? Like, what are the bad practices we don't want to do?
So the bad practices I've seen is where we've been patient for maybe a few weeks. We'll be patient. We'll just leave them alone. So the ignoring, I think, is a bad practice. Yeah. Being patient and then screaming at them, and then going back to being patient and then screaming. So I've seen that before too.
The roller coaster, right?
Yeah. So we want to avoid that as well. And remembering that this is about them, not us, because I think sometimes we get frustrated because we know they can do these things. So we try to push them, but we have to help them figure out, what they need to do. So even if they're saying, I can do this, you don't want them standing on the beam
Right.
in that fear, that immobilized fear. Like once they get that way, they can't think anymore. So getting them off, maybe just having them constantly doing those progressions to get to that skill again, having them do it on the low beam, even if they feel like they can move to the medium or high beam. Nope, you're going to do this many on the low beam, and we're going to go do progressions again. And this is kind of our routine until they have that confidence again. And then they can do, then they can move to the medium beam and with like a resi underneath of it, do it 5 times, and then if they're successful, that's okay. But we're going to do progressions in low beam again. And then, so it's just slow process with them, I think. And then if they're willing to talk to them about it. But
Totally. Yeah. Right. Finding the step they can be successful at is really important.
Exactly. And that's the thing, is like they want to get it, so they will try to push themselves, but then they're going to get stuck back in that immobilized fear. So it's really important to, in that moment, kind of make the decision for them that they're not going to be doing it full out like they want to. Like they have to do these things. They have to be successful for so long and show that their confidence is building back up before you let them go to, competing it normally or practicing that like you would compete it.
Right. Absolutely. And I think it's so hard for coaches, like you said, because they mean well, they love to see the kids be successful, but like you can't do it for them. Like at the end of the day, you can't make anybody do anything. So like no magical, yelling or something you're trying to do with a brain trick is going to just magically make it happen. They have to really want to change and then be willing to do it. But I think for me, something I've made a big mistake on is I think a lot of coaches know not to maybe, be harsh or yell, but I think sometimes it's more about what you don't say. I think sometimes they, like you said, ignore, and I'm really happy you said that. They don't mean it to be mean, but they just ignore the kid who's having a tough time. Like, oh God, I just can't deal with you. Like, I just don't know what to do. So I'll just let you be over there and do your thing. And the athlete just broods and gets resentful and stuff like that. So I think you have to, if they're willing to talk about it, talk about, like, why are you fearful? Like, what are the technical things we can do well? Can we map out a step-by-step progression back to maybe where you want to be? Sometimes it takes 2, 4, 6, 8 weeks, 10 weeks. Sometimes like you have to change the skill. Like it just doesn't work. And it's like, okay, you're just not going to do a back handspring for a while. That's okay. Let's do something else for a while. I've had other athletes learn stuff, and you have to kind of just remove your ego and the fear of judgment and the fear of people talking. If you create an environment where like fear is normal, mental blocks are a part of gymnastics. It happens, just like you get and lose skills sometimes. Welcome to the party. It's hard, but that's part of it. If the coaches, staff, and the team support that, I think the kids feel better about it. And there's no like, oh my God, I can't believe this person's not doing a back handspring series or something like that. It's so embarrassing to go to a meet and have them do just a front handspring because they're nervous about flipping a vault right now. Like, it's okay. That's part of the process. Like, who cares?
Yeah, no, just let them be, and they'll figure it out. And honestly, like if you are patient and you're willing to work with them through these like progressions and stuff of the mental block, you can enhance your trusting relationship with that gymnast substantially. So, and that will help prevent future mental blocks because you were patient and you were willing to work with them.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's amazing too, a lot of times when kids like will graduate or do their senior speech, or they'll come back and talk to us, they don't talk about, winning the medals and the meets and stuff like that. They talk about like through the hardest times when I was so frustrated and I couldn't do this skill and I had mental blocks, like you were still there, supportive, and just wanted what was best for me. And you didn't care about whether I competed, a flipping vault, or if I did like a huge release move that I aided on and I was nervous about. I think those things, in the moment, they don't seem like a big deal when you're just like there for the person unconditionally through their fear, and you're trying to figure out, asking for help, working with sports psychologists, working with mental health providers, like who can I talk to technically to get better drills or something to fix this? Can I get another set of eyes? I think in the moment, it's not a big deal to you. You're like, oh, I'm just trying to figure out what to help you. But in the long run, it's kind of one of the most impactful, biggest thing, because that's the worst. In some athletes, that's like the worst part for them. It's like when they have a huge mental block, or they really don't do well at a competition, or a huge letdown, they get an injury. Those are the worst moments in their career. And how you act as a coach, a parent, a medical provider to be there unconditionally really drives, like you said, that trust and that value. And I think they remember that a lot.
Oh yeah. Yeah, they definitely do. I agree with that 100%.
Well, this has been a wonderful conversation. I could talk to you for about 2 more hours, but I'm respectful of your time. And I just want to kind of give you the opportunity to say, like, where can people find you? What stuff do you have going on right now with Ian and stuff? I know you guys have a camp coming up and all that. Definitely plug that.
Oh, yes, we do. So yeah, I work with Ian Kreider, and he is considered the gymnastics doc on Facebook. So, we have that page where he gives physical therapy advice, and I've started with him and I do the mental health advice.
Awesome.
And it's been a lot of fun. We actually have a gymnastics camp coming up in Jacksonville this July, which is what's so great about it is not only are we going to be doing gymnastics, but we have, you know, a dietitian coming and we have
Christina,
me
right?
and what?
Christina, right?
Yes, yeah.
She's been on the podcast a few times. She's a fan favorite.
Yeah, she's great. And we're so excited because, you know, we're going to have different blocks where we're teaching them this stuff and we're trying to like, I'm going to be going in with them at practice, trying to help them through like discussing how we can use mindfulness and different like techniques and coping skills as we're practicing. So we're learning how to use those when we're at practice. And then we can take that stuff to competition with ourselves. So yeah, we're doing some great things. And I just work with Ian right now at Elevate Sport Performance, and I'm doing therapy.
That's great.
And helping out, you know, athletes and whoever wants it right now.
Yeah. Online stuff as well, or only in person?
Actually, only online right now.
There we go.
Yeah.
That's great. Where can people find you if they're interested in kind of more of the actual booking with you and stuff like that?
Well, you can either find me on the Facebook page, the Gymnastics Stopping. You can message me, or we have a webpage too that is Elevate Sport Performance, and you can go to that and you set up an appointment with me as well.
Perfect. Yeah, I have a feeling you're going to get a few more dings with messages after this podcast goes up. So I want to make sure people know.
Well, thank you.
Yeah, I'm super happy to hear that you're hanging out with Ian and doing that stuff. It sounds like you have great work going on. And I'm always trying my best to support as many grassroots new things that can happen in the community to just support, you know, people growing their network and stuff. So yeah, I appreciate your time and thanks for the wisdom and stuff like that. And I'm sure down the road, we'll probably have another one.
Oh, I hope so. Yeah, no, it's so fun. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, no problem.